The pen shook in Elena Whitmore's hand as her father pushed the marriage contract across the table toward a stranger she had never wanted to meet. "Sign it," her father whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Sign it now, before he changes his mind." Elena stared at the paper. The ink was still wet where Lord Harold Pemberton had scrawled his name minutes earlier, sealing a deal that would trade her future for her father's freedom. Outside the study window, rain hammered against the glass, matching the storm building inside her chest. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, had once been a respected merchant, a man whose name opened doors across the city. But 3 years of reckless gambling and failed investments had turned that respect into ruin. Now he owed money to men who did not forgive debts, men who sent enforcers instead of letters. Lord Pemberton's offer to clear those debts in exchange for Elena's hand had seemed, to her father, like salvation dropped from heaven. To Elena, it felt like being sold at auction. "Father, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There must be another way." "There is no other way." His eyes would not meet hers. "You don't understand what these men will do to us if I don't pay them. This is the only path left." Lord Pemberton, a balding man in his 50s with a smug curl to his lips, reached for the pen Elena still held. "Come now, my dear. It isn't so terrible. You'll want for nothing as my wife." Elena's stomach turned. She had met men like Pemberton before, men who spoke of wanting for nothing while meaning everything except respect, except freedom, except love. She looked at her father one last time, searching for some sign that he might stop this, that he might choose her over his debts. She found none. Her hand trembled as she lowered the pen toward the paper. The study door burst open before the nib touched ink. A tall figure filled the doorway, rain still clinging to his dark coat, his presence so commanding that the candles on the table seemed to flicker in response. Elena had never seen him before, but she recognized the name the moment her father gasped it aloud. Duke Ashworth. The room fell silent. Even Lord Pemberton's smugness drained from his face, replaced by something closer to fear. Alexander Ashworth stepped inside, his boots leaving wet prints on the polished floor. He was younger than Pemberton, perhaps 30, with sharp features and eyes the color of storm clouds. He carried himself like a man accustomed to rooms falling quiet at his arrival, and this room was no exception. "Forgive the interruption," Alexander said, though his tone suggested no genuine apology. "I understand there is a transaction taking place. I would like to make a better offer." Gerald Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. "Your Grace, this is a private matter." "Debts owed to Marcus Griggs and his associates are rarely private," Alexander replied evenly. "News travels fast among men who collect what is owed to them. I am prepared to settle your debt in full, twice what Lord Pemberton has offered." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. She looked between the two men, her father's desperate eyes flicking from the Duke to Pemberton and back again. Calculating. Always calculating. Pemberton's face reddened. "This is outrageous. We had an agreement." "Agreements can be improved upon," Alexander said, not even glancing at him. His gaze settled instead on Elena, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet held her still. "The decision, I believe, belongs to Mr. Whitmore. And perhaps, though it seems to have been forgotten in this room, to his daughter as well." Something in his words carried a quiet edge, almost a rebuke aimed at her father. Elena's cheeks burned, unsure whether to feel grateful or humiliated that a stranger had noticed what her own father had not. Gerald wiped his brow with a trembling hand. Twice the money meant more than freedom from Griggs. It meant a chance to rebuild, to hold his head up again among the merchants who had once respected him. Elena watched the greed flicker behind his eyes, watched him make a decision that had nothing to do with her happiness. "Your Grace," Gerald said slowly, "your offer is most generous." "Gerald," Pemberton snapped, "you cannot simply—" "I can," Gerald interrupted, some of his old merchant confidence returning now that the numbers favored him. "The debt was never truly settled between us, Harold. Nothing was signed." Pemberton's eyes darted to the contract on the table, to the space where Elena's signature should have been but was not. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Whatever business dealings connected him to Gerald Whitmore, it seemed, were not worth challenging a duke over. Elena stood frozen at the center of it all, the prize being negotiated over her head as though she were a piece of furniture instead of a woman with thoughts and fears of her own. She wanted to scream, to demand that someone, anyone, ask her what she wanted, but the words caught in her throat, buried under years of learning that her opinions mattered little in her father's house. Alexander seemed to notice her silence. His storm-gray eyes flicked to her again, softer this time, though his expression remained unreadable. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. Do you object to this arrangement? The question startled her. No one had asked her that all evening. She opened her mouth, unsure what answer would even matter. What choice did she truly have? Marry a man she did not know to save her father from ruin, or marry a different man she did not know for the same reason? Neither path led to freedom. Both led to a stranger's house, a stranger's name, a stranger's bed. Does it matter what I say? She asked quietly, the bitterness slipping through despite her efforts to sound composed. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, something almost like understanding, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. It should, he said, though I imagine tonight it will not change the outcome. At least he was honest. Elena found a strange, small comfort in that honesty, even as it confirmed her fear that she had no true say in her own fate. Gerald cleared his throat, eager to finalize the arrangement before Pemberton found his voice again, or the Duke reconsidered. Your Grace, if you are prepared to settle the debt tonight, I see no reason to delay. Elena will make you a fine wife. She is well-mannered, educated, and— Father, Elena said sharply, unable to bear hearing herself described like livestock at a market stall. Alexander held up a hand, silencing Gerald mid-sentence. There is no need to convince me of her worth, Mr. Whitmore. I have already decided. He turned to Elena once more. The wedding will take place within the week. My solicitor will handle the arrangements with your father regarding the debt. Just like that, her future was decided. Not by her own hand, not by her own heart, but by two men negotiating in a rain-soaked study while she stood silent between them. Pemberton, defeated and furious, gathered his coat and left without another word, the door slamming behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Gerald sagged with relief the moment he was gone, already speaking of the debt collectors he would finally be able to face without fear. Elena barely heard him. Her eyes were fixed on the Duke, on the man who had walked into her life uninvited and altered its course entirely within the span of a few sentences. He did not smile at her, did not offer comforting words or gentle reassurances. He simply studied her, as though trying to solve a puzzle he had only just begun to examine. You will need new gowns for the ceremony, Alexander said finally, his tone businesslike once more, any trace of softness gone. I will have my housekeeper sent to assist you with preparations. How generous, Elena said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite amusement, not quite offense. You are angry. Should I not be? She asked before she could stop herself. I have been discussed and traded like a piece of property tonight, Your Grace, twice in fact, within the same hour. For a moment Alexander said nothing. The candlelight flickered between them, casting shifting shadows across his sharp features. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost private, as though the words were not meant for her father's ears at all. You are right to be angry, he said. I will not pretend otherwise. But I promise you this, Miss Whitmore. Whatever this marriage becomes, you will not be treated as property in my house. That much I can give you. It was a strange promise, offered with no warmth, no tenderness, only quiet conviction. Elena did not know whether to believe him. She had learned, after all, that men made promises easily, and broke them just as easily when it suited their purposes. But something in his eyes, some flicker of sincerity beneath the coldness, made her wonder if perhaps this Duke was different from the men she had known before. Or perhaps she only wanted to believe it, because the alternative, that her entire future had just been decided by strangers over a rain-soaked negotiation table, was too painful to accept without some small hope to hold on to. Alexander turned to leave, pausing only at the door to look back at her one final time. The carriage will come for you in 3 days, he said. Be ready. Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving Elena standing alone in her father's study, with a future she had never chosen, and a husband she had never met, wondering what kind of man would pay twice the price for a bride he had only just laid eyes on, and what kind of life awaited her behind the gates of Ashworth Estate. Gerald exhaled a long breath and dropped into his chair, already reaching for a glass of brandy to celebrate his sudden reversal of fortune. He did not look at his daughter. He did not ask how she felt, or whether she was frightened, or whether her heart had broken quietly in the corner of the room while he counted the debt he would no longer owe. Elena walked to the window and pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching the Duke's carriage disappear down the darkened street. Rain streaked the pane like tears she refused to let fall in front of her father. She thought of her mother, gone 5 years now, and wondered what she would have said if she could see this moment. Would she have fought for her daughter's freedom, or would she too have bowed to the weight of debt and desperation? You should be thanking me, Gerald said suddenly, breaking the silence. A duke, Elena, do you understand what this means? You will want for nothing. You will have a title, a grand house, servants of your own. I would rather have had a choice, Elena said quietly, still facing the window. Her father scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Choices are a luxury for those who are not drowning in debt. I did what I had to do to save this family. One day you will understand that. Elena said nothing more. There was no point arguing with a man who had already convinced himself that selling his daughter was an act of love rather than desperation. She climbed the stairs to her room that night with a heavy heart, packing away childhood keepsakes she would soon leave behind, wondering if the cold Duke who had walked into her life like a storm would prove to be her salvation, or simply a different kind of cage. 3 days, he had said. 3 days until a carriage arrived to carry her toward a marriage she had never asked for, toward a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by the strange, unexpected honesty in his eyes. Elena did not know what awaited her at Ashworth Estate, but as she lay awake listening to the rain fade into a quiet drizzle, she made herself a silent promise. Whatever life demanded of her next, she would not lose herself completely. Somewhere beneath the fear and the fury, she would find a way to hold on to who she truly was. The carriage rocked violently as it hit another pothole, and Elena gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white beneath her gloves. Ashworth Estate loomed ahead through the misty morning, its towers rising like dark sentinels against a pale sky. This was it. There was no turning back now. 3 days had passed in a blur of fittings, packing, and forced smiles for neighbors who whispered behind their fans about the sudden, scandalous engagement between Elena Whitmore and the notorious Duke Alexander Ashworth. Some called it a fairy tale. Others called it a tragedy dressed in silk. Elena did not know which was true. She only knew that today she would become a duchess in name, though her heart remained entirely her own. The carriage rolled to a stop before the great iron gates, and a footman hurried to open the door. Elena stepped down onto the gravel drive, her legs unsteady, her breath catching at the sheer size of the estate before her. Ashworth Hall was no ordinary manor. It was a fortress of stone and history, its windows like watching eyes, its grounds stretching endlessly toward distant hills. Alexander stood waiting at the top of the stone steps, dressed in black as always, his expression as unreadable as it had been the night they first met. He descended slowly, offering his arm with mechanical politeness rather than affection. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "welcome to your new home." "Thank you, Your Grace," Elena replied, taking his arm because propriety demanded it, though every instinct told her to keep her distance from this stranger who now controlled her fate. The ceremony that afternoon was small, cold, and efficient, much like the man she married. A local clergyman read the vows in a chapel adorned with ancient stone carvings, and Elena repeated the words expected of her in a voice that sounded distant even to her own ears. Alexander's voice, by contrast, was steady and clear, betraying no emotion whatsoever, as though he were signing another business contract rather than pledging his life to a woman he barely knew. There was no kiss to seal the vows, only a brief, formal nod between them before the clergyman pronounced them husband and wife. No cheering guests filled the chapel, no joyful tears were shed. Only the housekeeper, a stern older woman named Margaret, and a handful of staff stood witness to the union, their faces carefully neutral, though Elena caught more than one curious glance thrown her way. That evening, Elena sat alone in the grand dining hall, the long table stretching before her like an accusation. Alexander had not joined her for the meal, called away by estate business that Margaret explained with practiced diplomacy, though Elena suspected her new husband simply preferred solitude to her company. She ate in silence beneath the watchful eyes of portraits depicting generations of Ashworth ancestors, wondering how many of them had also married strangers for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Margaret found her afterward in the west parlor, staring into the crackling fire with unseeing eyes. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, using the title with careful formality. "Shall I show you to your chambers?" Elena nodded, grateful for the distraction. Margaret led her through winding corridors lined with tapestries and portraits, past libraries filled with books that reached the ceiling, past a music room with a piano so fine it seemed almost sacred. The estate was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, grand and lonely all at once, much like its master. "The Duke does not entertain often," Margaret said as they walked, perhaps sensing Elena's unspoken questions. "He prefers quiet. It has been that way since his brother passed." Elena's steps faltered. "His brother?" Margaret's expression tightened, as though she had said more than intended. "It is not my place to speak of it, Your Grace. Perhaps in time, the Duke will share what he wishes you to know." The mention of a lost brother lingered in Elena's mind long after Margaret left her at the door of her new chambers, a spacious room decorated in soft blues and creams, warmer and gentler than she had expected from a man so cold. She wondered, as she prepared for bed, whether that warmth was meant for her or simply the taste of whichever decorator Alexander had hired years ago, long before she had ever entered his life. Sleep came slowly that first night, haunted by the strange sensation of belonging to a house full of shadows and secrets she did not yet understand. The following weeks settled into an uneasy rhythm. Elena rose early, took her breakfast alone, and spent her days exploring the vast estate or reading in the library, starved for conversation in a house that seemed to swallow sound whole. Alexander remained distant, appearing at dinner some evenings and vanishing into his study on others, his manner toward her polite but guarded, as though he feared what might happen if he allowed even a crack of warmth to show. Yet Elena began to notice things, small contradictions that did not fit the reputation of ruthlessness that preceded him through every conversation she overheard among the staff. One afternoon, walking near the stables, she found Alexander crouched beside a young stable boy who had fallen and scraped his knee badly. The Duke, feared throughout the county for his sharp business dealings and colder still personal reputation, was gently examining the wound, speaking to the boy in a soft, reassuring tone entirely unlike the clipped formality he used with Elena. "You will be fine," Alexander told the boy. "It looks worse than it is. Have Margaret clean it properly, and you may rest for the remainder of the day." The boy nodded, tears drying on his cheeks, clearly comforted by words that carried none of the coldness Elena had come to expect. When Alexander noticed her watching from a distance, something flickered across his face, quickly hidden behind his usual composed mask. "Miss Whitmore," he said, straightening, reverting instantly to formality. "I did not realize you were nearby." "You called him by name," Elena observed, unable to stop herself. "I did not know you knew the names of your stable staff." "I know the names of everyone who works this land," Alexander replied, a note of quiet pride in his voice. "They deserve at least that much respect." It was a small moment, but it lodged itself in Elena's memory, a piece of a puzzle that did not fit the picture painted by rumor and gossip. She began paying closer attention after that, noticing the way tenants who visited the estate spoke of the Duke with genuine gratitude rather than fear, the way servants who had worked for him for years showed no hesitation approaching him with problems or requests. This was not the portrait of a ruthless, heartless man that society whispered about in ballrooms and parlors across the county. And yet, when it came to Elena herself, Alexander remained guarded, almost defensive, as though he had built walls specifically designed to keep her at a careful distance. One evening, curiosity finally overcame her caution. She found him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, candlelight casting long shadows across his tired features. "May I ask you something?" she said from the doorway, startling him from his work. He looked up, surprised by her presence but not unwelcoming. "Of course." "Why did you offer twice the price for my hand?" she asked, the question that had haunted her since that rain-soaked night in her father's study finally spoken aloud. "You did not know me. You had never even seen me before that evening. Why would a man like you make such an offer for a stranger?" Alexander set down his pen slowly, considering her question with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything in his life. "Lord Pemberton is not a good man," he said finally. "His reputation with women in his household is not one I would wish upon anyone, let alone someone who had no say in the matter." Elena's breath caught. "You knew this, and yet my father did not?" "Your father was blinded by his own desperation," Alexander said, a hint of something bitter creeping into his tone. "Men in debt rarely see clearly. I have watched too many families destroyed by choices made in moments of panic. I could not allow it to happen again, not when I had the means to prevent it." "Again?" Elena asked softly, remembering Margaret's mention of a lost brother. Something shuddered behind Alexander's eyes, the brief warmth vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "That is a story for another time, Miss Whitmore. It grows late. You should rest." The dismissal stung, but Elena did not push further, sensing the fragile boundary she had nearly crossed. She left him alone with his ledgers and his silence, more curious than ever about the man she had married, about the tragedy that seemed to haunt every quiet corner of Ashworth Hall. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the distance between them began to shrink. Alexander started joining her for dinner more regularly, their conversations evolving from stiff formality into something resembling genuine exchange. He asked about her interests, listened when she spoke of her love for painting and poetry, even arranged for new art supplies to be delivered to her chambers without being asked, a gesture so unexpected that Elena found herself staring at the gift for several long minutes before finding words to thank him. "You did not have to do this," she told him that evening, holding a fine set of watercolors he had procured from the city. "I know," Alexander replied, something almost shy in his expression, a vulnerability she had not seen from him before. "I wanted to." It was such a small thing, and yet it meant more than Elena expected. For the first time since that rain-soaked night in her father's study, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps this marriage, born of desperation and cold calculation, might yet become something more than a business arrangement. Perhaps the ruthless Duke everyone warned her about was not the whole truth of Alexander Ashworth, but merely the armor he wore to protect something far more fragile underneath. She did not know yet what secrets he carried, what tragedy had shaped him into a man both feared and respected throughout the county. But she found herself wanting to know, wanting to peel back the layers of guardedness and discover the man beneath, a curiosity that frightened her almost as much as it intrigued her. That night, as she prepared for bed, Elena caught her own reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Weeks ago, she had been a frightened girl bargained away by her own father. Now, standing in the grand chambers of Ashworth Hall, she felt something stirring inside her that resembled hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. She did not yet know what the future held, whether this arrangement would blossom into genuine partnership or crumble under the weight of secrets still unspoken. But for the first time since arriving at Ashworth Estate, Elena allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she had not simply traded one cage for another, but had instead found the beginning of something entirely unexpected. A fortnight later, an invitation arrived for a gathering hosted by Lord and Lady Fenwick, close neighbors whose annual autumn ball drew nearly every notable family in the county. Elena had expected Alexander to decline, given Margaret's earlier remark about his preference for solitude, but he surprised her by agreeing without hesitation. "It would be good for you to be seen," he explained over breakfast, folding the invitation carefully. "The county has spent weeks speculating about our marriage. Better they see the truth for themselves than continue inventing stories." Elena spent the following days preparing, with a mixture of excitement and nervousness she had not felt since before her mother's passing. Margaret helped her select a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her dark hair beautifully, and for the first time in months, Elena caught herself looking forward to something beyond the quiet routine of estate life. The night of the ball arrived clear and cold, stars scattered brilliantly across the sky as their carriage rolled toward Fenwick Manor. Alexander sat across from her, dressed in formal black that suited his tall frame perfectly, his expression composed but not entirely unreadable, at least not to Elena anymore. She had learned over the past weeks to notice the small signs of tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened slightly whenever a subject grew uncomfortable. "You seem nervous," she observed as the manor came into view, its windows blazing with candlelight. "I dislike crowds," Alexander admitted, a rare confession that surprised her with its honesty. "Too many eyes, too many questions, but you deserve an evening of normalcy, whatever that might mean for people in our position." The gesture touched her more than she expected. When they entered the grand ballroom together, heads turned immediately, whispers rippling through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Elena felt the weight of countless curious stares, but Alexander's hand settled at the small of her back, steady and reassuring, a silent promise that she would not face the room alone. Introductions blurred together over the following hour, a parade of lords and ladies eager to examine the woman who had somehow captured the notoriously guarded Duke's attention. Elena handled the scrutiny with practiced grace, her mother's old lessons in etiquette serving her well despite the exhaustion building behind her polite smiles. It was during a brief respite near the refreshment table that Elena first noticed the woman watching Alexander with unmistakable intensity from across the room. She was strikingly beautiful, golden-haired and elegantly dressed in deep crimson, her gaze fixed on Alexander with an expression Elena could not quite place, somewhere between longing and calculation. "Who is that?" Elena asked quietly, nodding toward the woman. Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something guarded crossing his features before he composed himself once more. "Lady Charlotte Fenwick," he said, "our hostess's cousin. We were acquainted some years ago." Something in his tone suggested there was far more to that acquaintance than his brief explanation allowed. But before Elena could press further, Charlotte herself approached, her smile bright and practiced, though her eyes lingered coldly on Elena as introductions were made. "Alexander," Charlotte said warmly, far too warmly for someone he described as a mere acquaintance. "It has been too long, and this must be your new bride." Her gaze swept over Elena with barely concealed appraisal. "How fortunate for you, marrying a duke so quickly after your family's troubles became known." The comment landed like a slap, wrapped in false pleasantry, but Elena refused to let it show on her face. "Fortune has little to do with it, Lady Charlotte. My husband is a man of remarkable character." Alexander's hand tightened slightly at her back, though whether from surprise or approval, Elena could not tell. Charlotte's smile faltered for just a moment before recovering. "How lovely that you think so," she said smoothly. "I do hope the marriage suits you both. Do enjoy the evening." With that, she drifted back into the crowd, leaving behind a lingering unease that Elena could not quite shake. "There is history there," Elena said quietly once Charlotte was out of earshot. "History you have not told me." "There is," Alexander admitted, his jaw tight. "But not tonight, Elena. Please, allow me this one evening of peace before the past inserts itself into everything once more." It was the first time he had used her given name instead of the formal address he typically favored, and something about the softness in his voice, the quiet plea beneath the words, made her relent. She nodded, allowing the subject to rest, though she filed Charlotte's cold smile and pointed comments away for later consideration. The remainder of the evening passed more pleasantly than Elena expected. Alexander guided her through a slow dance beneath the ballroom's glittering chandeliers, his movements confident and surprisingly graceful for a man who claimed to dislike such gatherings. For a few precious minutes, surrounded by music and candlelight, Elena allowed herself to forget the circumstances of their marriage entirely, focusing instead on the warmth of his hand against hers, the quiet intensity in his gaze as he looked at her. "You dance well, Your Grace," she teased softly. "I had an excellent partner," he replied, and for the first time since she had known him, genuine warmth colored his voice, unguarded and real. The carriage ride home was quiet but comfortable, neither of them eager to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Elena watched the passing countryside through the window, replaying the evening's events in her mind, particularly Charlotte's pointed comments and the shadow that had crossed Alexander's face at the mere mention of their shared history. Whatever had happened between them, it clearly still carried weight, still cast a shadow over Alexander even years later. Elena resolved to learn the truth eventually, though she sensed pushing too hard, too quickly, would only drive him further behind the walls he had spent years constructing. As they arrived back at Ashworth Hall, Alexander helped her down from the carriage, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for tonight, for your words to Charlotte. You did not have to defend me." "You are my husband," Elena replied simply. "Whatever else this marriage may be, I will not stand by while others insult you, especially when their own history seems far more complicated than they wish to admit." A small, genuine smile touched his lips, the first true smile she had seen from him since their wedding day. "You continue to surprise me, Elena Whitmore." "Elena Ashworth now," she corrected softly. "Elena Ashworth," he repeated, testing the name as though savoring it for the first time. Outside her window, the moon rose high over the estate grounds, casting silver light across gardens she had only begun to explore. Somewhere in the house below, she knew Alexander remained awake in his study, working late into the night as he so often did, carrying burdens she did not yet understand. Elena resolved, as sleep finally claimed her, to learn those burdens, to earn his trust as he seemed slowly to be earning hers, whatever the cost, whatever the risk to her carefully guarded heart. Smoke curled from the burning letter in the fireplace before Elena could read more than a single line, and she spun around to find Alexander standing in the doorway of his study, his face pale with an anger she had never seen from him before. "What was that?" Elena demanded, her heart pounding. She had entered the study searching for a book she had left behind, only to stumble upon a letter addressed to Alexander that he clearly had not wanted her to see, snatching it from her hands and tossing it into the flames before she could finish reading the first sentence. "Nothing that concerns you," Alexander said, his voice tight with barely controlled tension. "It concerned my father's name," Elena pressed. "I saw it clearly before you burned it. What business do you have with Gerald Whitmore that requires secret correspondence?" Weeks had passed since the Fenwick ball, weeks that had brought Elena and Alexander closer than she ever imagined possible when she first arrived at Ashworth Hall as a frightened bride. Their dinners had become genuine conversations, filled with laughter and shared confidences. He had shown her his mother's old rose garden, hidden behind the eastern wall, tending it personally each week in memory of a woman Elena had never met but had come to feel she understood through Alexander's careful descriptions. She had begun, despite every warning she had given herself, to fall for the man beneath the ruthless reputation. But this moment, watching him burn a letter with such visible distress, reminded her how much remained hidden behind his guarded eyes. "Your father continues to make poor decisions with his newfound wealth," Alexander said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. I have been monitoring the situation to ensure it does not affect you. Monitoring? Elena's voice rose. You have been spying on my father? I have been protecting you, Alexander corrected, frustration creeping into his tone. There is a difference, though I understand why you might not see it that way. Elena crossed her arms, unwilling to let the matter drop so easily. Protecting me from what exactly? Tell me the truth, Alexander. I am tired of half-answers and burned letters. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire consuming the last remnants of whatever secret he had tried to hide. Finally, Alexander sighed, running a hand through his dark hair in a gesture of genuine exhaustion. Your father has resumed gambling, he said quietly. The money I paid to settle his previous debts has already been spent, much of it lost at the same tables that ruined him before. He has written to me twice now, requesting additional funds. Elena felt the color drain from her face. And you did not think to tell me this? I did not wish to burden you with more disappointment where your father is concerned, Alexander said. You have carried enough weight because of his choices already. Despite her anger at being kept in the dark, Elena recognized the protective intention behind his silence, even as it stung to realize he had been shielding her from painful truths without her knowledge or consent. I am not a child to be protected from difficult realities, she said, softer now. I would rather know the truth, however painful, than be kept in ignorance. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a decision being made behind those storm-gray eyes. You are right, he admitted. I apologize. It has become habit, I suppose, protecting people from painful truths rather than trusting them to bear the weight alongside me. Habit, born from your brother, Elena said gently, remembering Margaret's earlier words, sensing this might be the moment Alexander finally chose to share the story he had guarded so carefully since her arrival. Something in his posture changed, the tension in his shoulders softening into something more vulnerable. He gestured toward the two chairs near the fireplace, and Elena sat, waiting patiently as he composed himself before finally beginning to speak. My brother's name was William, Alexander said, his voice distant, as though traveling back through years of buried grief. 3 years older than me, the natural heir to our father's title. He was everything a future duke should be. Charming, generous, beloved by everyone who met him. I adored him growing up, wanted nothing more than to be like him. Elena remained silent, sensing this story required patience rather than interruption. William fell in love young, with a woman our father considered unsuitable, a merchant's daughter with no title or fortune to her name. Our father forbade the match, threatened to disown William entirely if he pursued it further. William, ever the dutiful son despite his love, agreed to end the relationship, believing he had no other choice. Alexander's jaw tightened, old pain resurfacing despite the years that had passed. The woman, devastated and desperate, turned to a moneylender for assistance leaving the county, hoping to start fresh somewhere William's memory would not haunt her. The moneylender was not an honest man. He trapped her in debts she could never repay. Debts that grew with each passing month, through schemes designed specifically to ensnare desperate, vulnerable people. What happened to her? Elena asked quietly, though some dark instinct told her she already sensed the tragic direction of this story. She took her own life, Alexander said, the words heavy with old sorrow, unable to see any escape from the debt consuming her future. William blamed himself entirely, blamed our father for forbidding the match, blamed himself most of all for lacking the courage to defy convention and marry the woman he truly loved. 6 months later, consumed by grief and guilt, he followed her into the same darkness, unable to continue living with what he saw as his own failure. Elena's breath caught, tears gathering unbidden in her eyes at the tragedy unfolding before her. Alexander, I am so sorry. I became Duke far sooner than anyone expected, Alexander continued, his voice steadying as he pushed through the remainder of the story. Our father, broken by grief himself, passed within the year, leaving me to inherit a title I never wanted, built upon a foundation of tragedy I could not undo. I swore then that I would never allow desperation and debt to destroy another family the way it destroyed mine, that I would use whatever power and wealth I possessed to intervene wherever I could, to prevent the same devastating chain of events from claiming other innocent lives. Understanding flooded through Elena, illuminating so much about the man she had married that had previously remained shrouded in mystery. His intervention that rain-soaked night in her father's study, his generous offer that had seemed so calculated and cold, had actually been born from genuine compassion, from a promise made to himself in the depths of unbearable grief. That is why you offered twice the price, Elena said softly. Not merely to win a negotiation, but because you recognized the pattern, the desperation that led my father to sell my future to settle his debts. I could not stand by and watch history repeat itself, Alexander confirmed, not when I possessed the means to prevent it. I did not expect, he paused, searching for words. I did not expect to come to care for you as deeply as I have, Elena. I entered this marriage believing I was simply preventing tragedy. I did not anticipate finding happiness alongside that protection. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded in a way Alexander rarely allowed himself to be. Elena felt her own heart swell with emotion, the careful walls she had built around herself since arriving at Ashworth Hall finally beginning to crumble entirely. I have come to care for you as well, she admitted quietly, more than I ever expected possible, given how our marriage began. Alexander reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand gently in his. Then perhaps, he said, we have both found something unexpected in circumstances neither of us chose. For a moment, the world outside the study seemed to fade entirely, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the fragile, precious connection blossoming between two people who had entered marriage as strangers, and were slowly, carefully becoming something far more meaningful to each other. But their quiet moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the study door. Margaret entered, her expression troubled, carrying a card on a small silver tray. Your Grace, she said, addressing Alexander with unusual urgency, Lady Charlotte Fenwick has arrived. She insists the matter is urgent and cannot wait until morning. Alexander's expression darkened immediately, the warmth of moments before replaced by wary tension. Elena felt a familiar unease settle in her stomach, remembering Charlotte's cold smile and pointed comments at the Fenwick ball weeks earlier. Show her to the drawing room, Alexander said reluctantly. I will attend to this. We will attend to this, Elena corrected firmly, rising from her chair. Whatever history existed between Alexander and Charlotte, whatever urgent matter had brought her to their door at such a late hour, Elena refused to be left waiting in ignorance once more. Alexander hesitated, then nodded, perhaps recognizing that their earlier conversation about honesty and trust extended beyond just her father's troubles. Together, they made their way toward the drawing room, where Charlotte waited with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something colder, more calculating, that made Elena's instincts sharpen with immediate wariness. Alexander, Charlotte said, rising as they entered, her eyes flicking briefly to Elena before returning to fix on him with unmistakable intensity. I apologize for the late hour, but I felt you needed to know immediately. There are rumors circulating through the county, rumors about your new wife's family that I believe will prove quite damaging if left unaddressed. What rumors? Alexander asked, his voice carefully neutral, though Elena noticed his hand had found hers again, steady and reassuring despite the tension filling the room. Charlotte's lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. It seems Gerald Whitmore has been seen at rather disreputable establishments recently, accumulating debts once again. Some are even whispering that the money you provided to settle his previous obligations has already been squandered entirely. People are beginning to question, Alexander, whether your marriage was truly the wise decision everyone believed it to be, or simply another example of the Whitmore family's talent for extracting wealth from generous, unsuspecting benefactors. The implication was clear and cutting, designed specifically to wound, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with humiliation despite knowing the rumors, however painful, held uncomfortable grains of truth regarding her father's continued recklessness. That is quite enough, Charlotte, Alexander said, his voice hardening into the commanding tone Elena remembered from their very first meeting. Whatever grievances you harbor from our past, I will not allow you to use my wife's family troubles as a weapon against her. Charlotte's composure flickered, something raw and wounded briefly visible beneath her carefully maintained mask. I only wish to warn you, Alexander, as someone who once cared for you deeply. These rumors will spread whether or not you wish to hear them from me. Then let them spread, Elena said, finding her voice despite the humiliation still burning through her chest. My father's choices are his own, Lady Charlotte, and I will not be shamed for circumstances entirely beyond my control. If you truly wish to warn us out of genuine concern, you would not have delivered this news with such evident satisfaction. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation from the woman she likely still viewed as a naive newcomer to society's cruel games. For a moment, something almost like respect flickered across her features before her guarded expression returned entirely. You have chosen well, Alexander, Charlotte said finally, gathering her cloak with deliberate composure. Perhaps better than I gave you credit for. I will take my leave now. Consider yourselves warned, regardless of how you choose to receive it. She departed without further ceremony, leaving behind a heavy silence in her wake. Elena turned to Alexander, uncertainty and fresh worry replacing the tender warmth of their earlier conversation in the study. "The rumors," she said quietly. "They are likely true, are they not? About my father?" Alexander's expression softened with obvious sympathy. "It seems so, based on the letters I have received. But Elena, listen to me carefully. Whatever your father chooses to do with his own life, it does not define you. It never has, and it never will, not in this house, not while I have breath to defend you." Despite the fear curling through her chest at the thought of renewed scandal, at the thought of her father once again threatening the fragile peace she had found at Ashworth Hall, Elena found comfort in the fierce conviction behind Alexander's words. Whatever storms lay ahead, whatever secrets and rivals still threatened the life they were building together, she no longer faced them entirely alone. That night, as they retired to their separate chambers, Alexander paused at her door, his expression conflicted. As though weighing words, he was uncertain whether to speak. "Elena," he said finally, "whatever happens in the coming days, I need you to know that my feelings for you are genuine, not born from obligation or guilt, but from truly knowing you these past weeks." "I know," Elena replied softly, and found, to her own surprise, that she truly did believe him. "I feel the same, Alexander. Whatever storms we face, I believe we will face them together now." He nodded, something like relief passing across his features before he bid her good night and retreated to his own chambers. Elena remained in the hallway a moment longer, staring at the closed door of his room, her heart full of conflicting emotions, fear for what her father's continued recklessness might bring, but also a fragile, growing hope that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Alexander might face them as true partners rather than strangers, bound merely by circumstance and cold calculation. The storm, she sensed, was far from over. Charlotte's warning carried undertones of deeper malice than a simple concern for gossip, and her father's renewed recklessness threatened consequences neither she nor Alexander could yet fully predict. But for the first time since that rain-soaked night in her father's study, Elena felt genuinely prepared to face whatever came next, armed not with fear, but with the unexpected strength of a marriage slowly transforming into something real. The following morning, Elena requested the carriage be prepared for a visit to her father's townhouse, determined to confront the rumors directly, rather than allow uncertainty to fester any longer. Alexander offered to accompany her, but she gently declined, sensing this conversation needed to happen between father and daughter alone, without the added weight of her husband's imposing presence complicating an already difficult exchange. Gerald Whitmore's townhouse looked different than she remembered from her final night there months earlier. The gardens, once carefully tended, had grown wild and neglected. The curtains hung slightly askew in several windows, small signs of a household slipping quietly into disorder, despite the fortune that should have secured its stability. Her father greeted her at the door himself, no butler announcing her arrival, which struck Elena as unusual, until she noticed the household staff had clearly been reduced significantly since her departure. Gerald's face, once robust with the confidence of a successful merchant, now looked thinner, his eyes carrying dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting worry. "Elena," he said, surprise, and something like guilt flickering across his features. "I did not expect you." "Clearly," she replied, stepping past him into the entrance hall, noting the empty spaces on the walls where paintings had once hung, likely sold to cover fresh debts. "I have heard troubling rumors, father. I came to learn the truth for myself." Gerald's shoulders sagged, the weight of pretense finally too heavy to maintain in his daughter's direct presence. "Come, sit," he said wearily, leading her toward a sitting room considerably less grand than she remembered. "You have been gambling again," Elena said once they were seated, refusing to soften the accusation with gentler phrasing. "The money Alexander provided, meant to secure our family's future, has already been squandered." "It is not so simple as that," Gerald protested weakly, though his eyes could not quite meet hers, confirming the truth behind Charlotte's cruel rumors. "I made investments that did not succeed as planned. I merely sought to grow the fortune further, to ensure our family's security for generations, not simply for the present moment." "Investments," Elena repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. "Is that what we are calling it now? Father, I stood in that study and watched you trade my future for your debts. I have tried, despite everything, to forgive that choice, to believe it came from desperation rather than selfishness. But if you have squandered the very fortune meant to secure our family's stability, what was the purpose of my sacrifice at all?" Gerald flinched at her words, old guilt finally surfacing through his carefully maintained denial. "You are right to be angry," he admitted quietly. "I have failed you, Elena, not once but repeatedly. I do not know how to stop myself once the cards are dealt. Once the possibility of winning back what I have lost presents itself, it is a sickness, I think, though that offers little comfort or excuse for what my choices have cost you." For the first time, Elena heard something genuine beneath her father's usual bluster, an admission of weakness rather than justification. It did not erase the pain of being bargained away like property, nor did it undo months of anxiety over renewed scandal threatening the fragile happiness she had found at Ashworth Hall. But it offered perhaps a small measure of understanding regarding the desperate compulsion driving his continued recklessness. "You must stop, father," Elena said firmly, "not for my sake alone, though the rumors threaten consequences for my marriage that you cannot fully understand. You must stop for your own sake, before this sickness claims everything you have left, including whatever relationship might still remain between us." Gerald nodded slowly, though Elena recognized the familiar hollow quality of promises made in moments of guilt rather than genuine resolve. She left the townhouse that afternoon with little true reassurance, but with clarity regarding the limits of what she could control. Her father's choices belonged to him alone. She could not save him from himself, however much guilt lingered at the thought of leaving him to face his troubles without her constant intervention. The carriage ride back to Ashworth Hall passed in contemplative silence, Elena's mind turning over the confrontation, searching for peace amid the tangled emotions her father's continued failures stirred within her. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences Charlotte's rumors might yet bring, Elena resolved to protect the fragile happiness she had found with Alexander, refusing to let her father's recklessness destroy the one true partnership she had discovered amid so much unwanted upheaval. Newspapers scattered across the breakfast table as Alexander slammed his fist down hard enough to rattle the teacups, his face contorted with a fury Elena had never witnessed from him before. "Alexander," she said, alarmed, rising from her chair. "What is it?" He turned the paper toward her without a word, and Elena's stomach dropped as she read the headline splashed across the front page in bold, damning print. The article detailed her father's gambling debts in humiliating specificity, questioned the true nature of her sudden marriage to the Duke, and hinted, with poisonous insinuation, that Elena herself had orchestrated the entire arrangement to rescue her family from financial ruin at Alexander's considerable expense. "This is Charlotte's doing," Alexander said, his voice cold with barely restrained anger. No one else possessed both the knowledge and the malice necessary to construct such a detailed, damaging account. Elena's hands trembled as she scanned the remaining paragraphs, each sentence more cutting than the last, painting her as a calculating fortune hunter, rather than a woman who had never wanted this marriage in the first place. "How could she do this?" Elena whispered. "After everything, after the warning she gave us herself, why would she then proceed to destroy us regardless?" "Because the warning was never truly meant to help us," Alexander said grimly. "It was reconnaissance, Elena. She came to gather information, to confirm the rumors held enough truth to construct a story that would prove impossible to fully deny." The days that followed brought consequences swift and severe. Invitations that had once arrived regularly ceased entirely. Neighbors who had greeted Elena warmly at the Fenwick ball now offered only cold, distant nods when their paths crossed in town. Whispers followed her wherever she went, poisonous and persistent, exactly as Charlotte had intended. Worse still, Elena learned that several of Alexander's business associates had begun questioning his judgment, some even withdrawing from partnerships and investments they had maintained for years, unsettled by the scandal now attached to his name. The reputation he had spent years building, the respect he had earned through fair dealing and genuine care for those around him, now teetered precariously under the weight of Charlotte's carefully constructed lies. "This is my fault," Elena said one evening, finding Alexander alone in his study, surrounded by correspondence addressing the mounting crisis. "If you had never offered for my hand, none of this would threaten your reputation now." "Do not speak such nonsense," Alexander said firmly, setting aside his papers to face her directly. "I chose this marriage freely, Elena. I chose you freely, and I do not regret that choice regardless of the difficulties we now face together. But your business, your reputation, can be rebuilt," Alexander interrupted. "What cannot be rebuilt so easily is trust between two people who have chosen to stand together despite hardship. I did not marry you to abandon you the moment circumstances grew difficult, Elena. I intend to fight for what we have built, not surrender it to Charlotte's manipulations." His conviction steadied something within her, though fear still gnawed at the edges of her composure. "What do we do?" she asked. "How do we counter lies that have already spread so far beyond our control?" Alexander considered the question carefully, old strategic instincts sharpening beneath his troubled expression. "The truth," he said finally. "We counter lies with truth, spoken plainly and publicly, rather than allowing Charlotte's version of events to stand unchallenged." "You mean to speak publicly about your brother?" Elena said, understanding immediately the sacrifice such a strategy would require. About the tragedy that shaped your intervention in my father's affairs. If necessary, Alexander confirmed, though pain flickered behind his eyes at the prospect of exposing such deeply guarded grief to public scrutiny. I have kept William's story private for years, unwilling to expose his memory to gossip and speculation. But if sharing that truth protects you from Charlotte's lies, protects the life we are building together, then the sacrifice is worth making. Elena's heart swelled with gratitude and love at the depth of his commitment, even as guilt weighed heavily at the thought of him revisiting such painful memories on her behalf. Are you certain? She asked softly. Once shared, that story cannot be taken back. I am certain, Alexander said, reaching for her hand with quiet determination. William's tragedy taught me the cost of silence, of allowing desperation and shame to fester unspoken, until they claim everything precious. I will not repeat that mistake now, not when speaking honestly might save what we have built together. Before they could finalize their plans, however, a new crisis arrived at their door. Margaret entered the study hurriedly, her usually composed expression tight with worry. Your Grace, she said, addressing Alexander, there is a man here demanding to see you immediately. He claims urgent business regarding Mr. Whitmore. Alexander and Elena exchanged a worried glance before proceeding to the entrance hall, where a rough-looking man waited impatiently, his clothing suggesting he was not accustomed to formal estates or polite society. Your Grace, the man said without preamble, my name is Marcus Griggs. I believe you are familiar with my previous dealings regarding Gerald Whitmore's debts. Elena's blood ran cold at the name, remembering Alexander's earlier mention of Griggs and his associates, men who did not forgive debts easily or gently. I settled Whitmore's debts to you months ago, Alexander said carefully, his posture shifting into the commanding presence Elena remembered from their first meeting. You settled his previous debts, Griggs clarified, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. He has since accumulated new obligations, considerably more substantial than before, and shows no sign of possessing the means to repay them. I have come to inform you directly, Your Grace, given your evident interest in protecting the Whitmore family, that patience regarding these new debts is not infinite. How much does he owe you now? Elena asked, stepping forward despite the fear tightening her chest. Griggs's eyes flicked toward her, calculating something behind his weathered features. Considerably more than what your husband paid previously, my lady. Enough that I have begun considering more permanent solutions to ensure repayment, solutions your father will find considerably less pleasant than a simple financial transaction. The threat, though delivered with careful ambiguity, chilled Elena to her core. You would harm him, she said, more statement than question. I would ensure my associates receive what is owed to them, Griggs corrected coldly. How that occurs depends entirely on whether the debt is settled through legitimate means or through methods I would prefer to avoid but will not hesitate to employ if necessary. Alexander's jaw tightened, old fury and protective instinct warring visibly behind his controlled expression. I will address this matter directly with Mr. Whitmore, he said firmly. You need not concern yourself further, Mr. Griggs. See that you do, Griggs replied, retrieving his hat from where he had set it upon entering. I would prefer resolution through civil means, Your Grace. But I assure you, my patience has considerable limits, especially given how poorly your previous generosity was repaid. He departed without further ceremony, leaving Elena and Alexander standing in tense silence within the grand entrance hall of Ashworth Hall, the weight of renewed crisis settling heavily upon shoulders already burdened by Charlotte's damaging scandal. I cannot continue rescuing him indefinitely, Alexander said quietly once Griggs had gone, though pain rather than anger colored his words. Not while our own reputation hangs by such a fragile thread. Elena, I need you to understand, whatever decision I make regarding your father's new debts, it comes from necessity rather than lack of compassion. I understand, Elena said, though her voice trembled with the weight of impossible choices pressing upon her from every direction. My father has made his own bed through years of reckless choices. I cannot ask you to sacrifice everything we have built to rescue him yet again, not when his own promises to change have proven so consistently hollow. Despite her brave words, tears gathered in her eyes. Grief for the father she had once respected, now reduced to a man whose weakness threatened to destroy everyone who cared for him. Alexander pulled her gently into his arms, offering silent comfort as the full weight of their compounding troubles finally broke through her carefully maintained composure. We will find a way through this, Alexander murmured against her hair. Together, Elena. Whatever comes next, we face it as partners, not as strangers bound by circumstance. That evening, as they prepared to implement their plan to counter Charlotte's damaging scandal, An unexpected visitor arrived at Ashworth Hall, one whose presence would ultimately prove pivotal in unraveling the deeper truth behind the crisis threatening to consume everything Elena and Alexander had built together. Lady Fenwick herself, Charlotte's own aunt and the hostess of the ball where the scandal had first begun brewing, requested an urgent audience. Elena and Alexander received her in the drawing room, uncertain what new complication her arrival might bring. Your Grace, Lady Fenwick said, addressing them both with unusual gravity. I have come because my conscience will not allow me to remain silent any longer. I fear my niece's actions have grown far more malicious than simple jealousy over a lost romance. Jealousy? Elena asked, confusion mixing with dawning understanding. Charlotte loved you once, Lady Fenwick said, addressing Alexander directly. Truly loved you, before circumstances separated you years ago. When she learned of your sudden marriage, something within her seemed to break entirely. I believe the scandal she has orchestrated stems not merely from spite but from genuine desperation to reclaim what she believes was unfairly taken from her. Alexander's expression darkened with old, complicated grief. Charlotte and I were never truly promised to each other, he said quietly. Our families discussed a potential match years ago, before William's death changed everything. I made clear then that my heart was not engaged, that any future match required genuine affection rather than mere convenience. She never fully accepted that truth, it seems, even after all these years. Regardless of the reasons, Lady Fenwick continued, I fear her actions have grown dangerous. I discovered correspondence, suggesting she intends to escalate matters further, perhaps even fabricating evidence, suggesting impropriety within your household, to ensure the scandal proves impossible to overcome. Elena's heart raced at this new revelation, the depth of Charlotte's obsession far exceeding anything she had previously imagined. What kind of evidence? She asked, fear tightening her voice. I do not know the specifics, Lady Fenwick admitted, only that she has been meeting privately with a journalist, known for sensationalized, often fabricated stories, a man with little regard for truth when opportunity for scandal presents itself. I believe you have little time to counter whatever plan she intends to execute. The urgency of Lady Fenwick's warning settled heavily over the room. Whatever fragile plans Alexander and Elena had begun forming to address the current scandal now required immediate revision, a race against time to prevent Charlotte's escalating obsession from destroying not only their reputation, but potentially their marriage itself. Thank you for coming to us, Alexander said finally, gratitude evident despite the fresh anxiety Lady Fenwick's warning had introduced. This information may prove essential in protecting what remains of our reputation. Lady Fenwick nodded, gathering her cloak with visible relief at having finally unburdened her conscience. I am sorry for my niece's actions, truly. She was not always this way, before grief and unrequited love twisted something within her that I fear may never fully heal. I wish you both strength in the days ahead. After she departed, Elena and Alexander sat together in tense silence, the weight of multiplying threats pressing heavily upon their fragile happiness. Her father's mounting debts, Griggs's ominous threats, and now Charlotte's escalating obsession combined into a storm that threatened to overwhelm everything they had carefully built together over the preceding months. We cannot face all of this separately, Elena said finally, determination steadying her voice despite the fear still coursing through her veins. Whatever Charlotte intends, whatever consequences my father's choices bring, we must face them together, as true partners, exactly as we promised each other. Alexander took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring despite the uncertainty clouding their future. Together, he agreed. Whatever storm approaches, Elena, I promise you, we will weather it together, or not at all. Outside, storm clouds gathered ominously over Ashworth Estate, an echo of the turbulent battle now brewing between truth and manipulation, between genuine love hard-won through months of careful trust-building, and the desperate, obsessive schemes of a woman determined to destroy what she herself had lost the chance to claim. By morning, Alexander had already summoned his solicitor and dispatched inquiries to identify the journalist Lady Fenwick had mentioned. It did not take long to uncover his name. A man called Edmund Price, notorious throughout the city for stories that stretched truth far beyond recognition in pursuit of sales and scandal. Alexander decided the only way to prevent disaster was to reach the man directly, before Charlotte's fabricated evidence could find its way into print. Elena insisted on accompanying him, refusing to be left behind while her own reputation hung in the balance. They found Price at a modest office near the printing district, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a calculating gleam in his eye that turned wary the moment he recognized his visitors. Your Grace, Price said, rising quickly from his desk, surprise evident despite his attempt at composure. I was not expecting such distinguished company. I understand you have been in correspondence with Lady Charlotte Fenwick, Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. Regarding a story involving my household. Price's eyes flicked nervously toward the door, as though calculating the distance to escape. I cannot discuss the details of my sources, Your Grace. Journalistic integrity requires... Journalistic integrity, Elena interrupted, unable to contain her frustration, would require verifying claims before printing them, Mr. Price, rather than accepting fabricated evidence from a woman motivated entirely by jealousy and obsession. Something in her direct challenge seemed to unsettle the journalist more than Alexander's commanding presence had managed. Price shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them. I have not yet printed anything definitive, he admitted finally. Lady Fenwick promised evidence that would prove substantial. I have been waiting to receive it before committing the story to print. And if that evidence proves fabricated, Alexander asked, if you print falsehoods that destroy an innocent woman's reputation, based on nothing more than a jealous woman's manufactured lies, what becomes of your own credibility, Mr. Price, when the truth eventually surfaces, as truth invariably does? The threat, delivered with quiet authority rather than raised voices, seemed to land more effectively than any shouted accusation might have. Price's confidence visibly wavered, old instincts for self-preservation clearly warring against the promise of a sensational story. What proof do you offer that her claims are false? Price asked finally, some journalistic caution reasserting itself beneath his obvious nervousness. Alexander exchanged a glance with Elena before answering. I will tell you a story, Mr. Price, one I have shared with very few people beyond this room. A story about my brother, about the true reason I intervened in Gerald Whitmore's affairs, about compassion rather than the calculated fortune-hunting Charlotte wishes you to believe defines my marriage. Over the following half hour, Alexander recounted William's tragedy with a raw honesty that visibly affected even the hardened journalist, old grief lending weight and authenticity to every word. Elena watched Price's expression shift from calculated skepticism to something approaching genuine sympathy, the manufactured scandal Charlotte had constructed crumbling beneath the simple, painful truth of a man's genuine attempt to prevent history from repeating itself. I did not know, Price said quietly once Alexander finished, old cynicism momentarily forgotten. Lady Fenwick presented an entirely different account, one suggesting calculated manipulation rather than genuine compassion. Lady Fenwick has her own reasons for wishing to believe the worst of this marriage, Elena said gently. Reasons that have little to do with truth and everything to do with old wounds that have never properly healed. Price sat in contemplative silence for several long moments, weighing the competing narratives now before him. Finally, he nodded slowly. I will not print her story, he said. Whatever evidence she claims to possess, I cannot in good conscience publish accusations that appear built upon such fragile, potentially fabricated foundations, not after hearing the truth directly. Relief flooded through Elena, though she recognized the battle was far from entirely won. Thank you, Mr. Price, she said sincerely. Your integrity in this matter means more than you likely realize. As they departed his office, Alexander's expression remained troubled, despite the small victory they had secured. This resolves one threat, he said, but Charlotte remains determined, and your father's debts to Griggs still loom unresolved. We have averted disaster today, Elena, but the storm has not yet fully passed. Elena nodded, steeling herself for whatever challenges still awaited them. Then we continue facing them, one at a time, together, she said, determination steadying her voice despite the exhaustion of the day's events. We have overcome one obstacle. We will overcome the others as well. As their carriage rolled back toward Ashworth Hall through streets slick with the day's earlier rain, Elena allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection, recognizing how far she had traveled since that terrifying night in her father's study. Bargained away like property to a stranger she now trusted with her deepest fears and fragile hopes alike. Whatever remained ahead, whatever final confrontation with Charlotte or resolution with her father's mounting debts still awaited them, Elena faced it now not as a frightened bride forced into an unwanted marriage, but as a woman who had found genuine partnership amid unimaginable circumstances, determined to protect what she and Alexander had built together, whatever the cost. Glass shattered against the drawing room wall as Charlotte Fenwick's composure finally broke entirely, her carefully maintained mask of elegance crumbling into raw, unfiltered fury the moment she learned her plan with the journalist had failed. She had arrived at Ashworth Hall uninvited that very afternoon, storming past Margaret's attempts to announce her properly, finding Elena alone in the drawing room, while Alexander remained occupied with estate business elsewhere in the house. You ruined everything, Charlotte hissed, advancing toward Elena with an intensity that made her instinctively step backward. I spent years hoping Alexander would finally see reason, finally recognize what we could have built together. And you appear from nowhere, some merchant's daughter with nothing to offer beyond a father's crushing debts, and steal everything I deserved. I did not steal anything, Elena replied, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear coiling in her chest. Alexander chose this marriage freely, Charlotte, exactly as he explained to you himself. Whatever history exists between you, it does not grant you ownership over his heart or his choices. You know nothing of our history, Charlotte spat, tears now mixing with fury in her reddened eyes. We were meant to marry, before his brother's foolish tragedy consumed his family entirely, and turned him cold, distant, unwilling to honor promises made between our families years earlier. I waited, Elena. I waited faithfully for him to heal, to return to the man I once loved, only to watch him hand his heart to a stranger purchased at auction like common property. The bitter accusation, however cruelly phrased, struck uncomfortably close to old wounds Elena had spent months working to heal. I was not purchased, she said firmly, refusing to let old shame resurface now, not when so much depended on standing firm against Charlotte's manipulation. Whatever circumstances brought Alexander and me together, what exists between us now is genuine, earned through months of honesty and trust, not calculation or convenience. Genuine, Charlotte repeated with bitter scorn. How touching. Perhaps you truly believe that fiction, blinded by whatever comfort a duke's fortune and title provide. But I know Alexander, Elena, in ways you never will. I know the guilt that drives him, the compulsion to rescue broken, desperate people as penance for his brother's death. You are not truly loved. You are simply the most recent recipient of his endless need for redemption. The words, though clearly weaponized to wound, carried enough uncomfortable truth to make Elena's resolve waver momentarily. Had she mistaken guilt-driven compassion for genuine love? Had months of growing closeness merely been Alexander's continued attempt to atone for a tragedy that had nothing to do with her at all? Before doubt could fully take root, however, a familiar voice interrupted from the doorway. That is enough, Charlotte. Alexander stood in the entrance, his expression carrying a controlled fury that Elena had rarely witnessed, even during their most difficult confrontations of recent weeks. He crossed the room swiftly, positioning himself protectively beside Elena, his presence immediately steadying the doubt Charlotte's cruel words had briefly stirred. I heard everything, Alexander continued, his voice hardening with each word. Your schemes with the journalist, your desperate attempts to poison Elena's mind against everything we have built together. I have shown you patience, Charlotte, out of respect for whatever affection once existed between our families. That patience has now entirely expired. Charlotte's defiant expression faltered slightly beneath his cold fury, though desperation kept her fighting even as the ground shifted beneath her carefully constructed narrative. Alexander, please, you must see reason. This marriage was never meant to last, born from desperation and debt rather than genuine affection. I only wish to save you from a mistake you will eventually regret. The only mistake, Alexander said firmly, was ever entertaining the notion that our family's old arrangement carried any weight beyond convenience, an arrangement I made clear years ago held no genuine affection on my part. You have spent years, it seems, constructing a fantasy that never reflected reality, and now you seek to destroy genuine happiness simply because you cannot accept a truth you have long refused to acknowledge. Tears streamed freely down Charlotte's face now, months, perhaps years, of carefully suppressed grief and obsession finally breaking through entirely. I loved you, she whispered brokenly. I truly did, Alexander, more than this merchant's daughter with her convenient tragedy ever could. Love does not manufacture scandal to destroy innocent people, Elena said quietly, finding her own voice steadied now that Alexander stood firmly beside her. Whatever you felt for Alexander, Charlotte, what you have done these past weeks reflects obsession rather than genuine affection. I am sorry, for whatever pain drives you to such desperate measures, truly. But I will not allow that pain to destroy the life Alexander and I have built together. Something in Elena's words, delivered with genuine compassion rather than triumphant cruelty, seemed to finally penetrate through Charlotte's desperate fury. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her posture as reality settled heavily upon her. What will you do now? Charlotte asked quietly, addressing Alexander directly, resignation replacing her earlier defiance. I will not pursue legal consequences for your actions, Alexander said, out of respect for whatever history existed between our families. But you will cease this campaign against Elena and myself immediately and completely. Should you attempt further schemes, further manipulation of journalists, or fabricated evidence, I assure you, my patience regarding legal recourse will not extend a second time." Charlotte nodded slowly, defeat evident in every line of her posture. She departed without further words, leaving behind a heavy silence that gradually gave way to relief, as Elena finally allowed herself to release the tension she had carried throughout the confrontation. "Are you well?" Alexander asked gently, turning to face her fully now that Charlotte had gone. "I am," Elena said, though her voice trembled slightly with the aftermath of confrontation. "Though her words troubled me more than I wish to admit. Alexander, is it true? Does guilt over your brother's death drive your affection for me, rather than genuine love?" Alexander's expression softened immediately, understanding the vulnerability behind her question. He reached for her hands, holding them gently as he searched for words adequate to address her fears. "I will not pretend William's tragedy holds no influence over who I have become," he said carefully. "It shaped my desire to intervene when I saw your father's desperation threatening your future, exactly as Charlotte suggested. But Elena, what I feel for you now extends far beyond that initial impulse toward rescue and redemption." He guided her toward the window, gesturing toward the estate grounds beyond, toward the rose garden his mother had once tended and he now cared for personally in her memory. "I have watched you these past months," he continued, "watched your kindness toward the staff, your courage confronting your father's failures, your fierce defense of me against Charlotte's cruelty. Despite having every reason to doubt my own affections, I did not fall in love with a tragedy to be rescued, Elena. I fell in love with you, with your strength and compassion, and the quiet resilience you have shown through every difficulty we have faced together." Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, old doubts finally dissolving beneath the sincerity evident in his every word. "I love you as well," she said softly. "Not from gratitude for rescue, not from obligation born of circumstance, but from genuine affection that has grown steadily since that very first night you walked into my father's study and changed everything." Alexander drew her closer, his hand cupping her face gently as he studied her expression with open tenderness he had once guarded so carefully. "Then let us put aside doubt entirely," he said. "Whatever Charlotte's schemes, whatever difficulties your father's choices continue to bring, we face them as partners, who have chosen each other freely, regardless of how our marriage first began." The following weeks brought gradual resolution to the remaining challenges threatening their happiness. Alexander, working alongside Elena rather than simply protecting her from difficult truths, negotiated directly with Marcus Griggs, establishing a structured arrangement that ensured her father's new debts would be repaid gradually, through supervised employment within one of Alexander's business ventures, rather than through another reckless bailout that would simply enable further destructive gambling. Gerald Whitmore, faced finally with genuine consequences for his choices rather than repeated rescue, entered the arrangement with something resembling true humility for the first time in years. Elena visited him periodically throughout the following months, watching cautiously as small, genuine changes began emerging, a man slowly rebuilding not merely his fortune, but his character, one honest day of labor at a time. Charlotte, true to Alexander's warning, withdrew entirely from their social circle, eventually accepting a position accompanying her aunt on an extended journey abroad, distance perhaps offering the healing that proximity to Alexander's happiness could never provide. As autumn deepened into winter, Ashworth Hall transformed gradually from the cold, lonely fortress Elena had first entered as a frightened, unwilling bride, into a home filled with genuine warmth and laughter. She and Alexander hosted their own small gathering that winter, nothing so grand as the Fenwick Ball, but intimate and joyful, filled with friends who had proven genuine throughout the difficult months preceding, a stark contrast to the false pleasantries and hidden cruelty that had once threatened their happiness. Late one afternoon in early winter, Elena visited her father at the modest lodgings he now occupied above the warehouse where he had begun working under Alexander's supervision, a far cry from the grand townhouse he had once called home, yet somehow more genuine than anything she remembered from her childhood there. She found him bent over a ledger, ink-stained fingers carefully recording figures with a diligence she had never witnessed from him before. He looked up at her arrival, surprise and something like shy pride crossing his weathered features. "Elena," he said, setting aside his work, "I did not expect you today. I wanted to see how you were managing," she replied, settling into the chair across from his modest desk. "Truly managing, father, not simply telling me what you believe I wish to hear." Gerald studied her for a long moment, something contemplative in his expression that Elena had rarely seen from him in years past. "It is difficult," he admitted honestly. "Harder than I imagined, waking each morning to honest labor rather than the promise of quick fortune from a lucky hand of cards. But it is also clarifying, in a way I did not expect. I sleep more soundly now than I have in years, strange as that may sound. It does not sound strange at all, Elena said softly, genuine warmth replacing the guarded caution she had carried into previous visits. Perhaps honest effort brings a peace that reckless gambling never could, regardless of how much fortune it occasionally promised. Gerald nodded slowly, old shame flickering briefly across his features before he found the courage to continue. I have thought often these past months about that night in my study, he said quietly, about the choice I made, trading your future for my own desperate relief. I told myself then that I had no other option, that circumstances forced my hand entirely. But watching you now, watching the strength and grace with which you have built genuine happiness despite my failures, I recognize how selfish that choice truly was. I am sorry, Elena. Truly, deeply sorry, for the pain I caused you that night and for years of choices before it that placed my own weaknesses above your well-being. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes at the sincerity finally present in her father's long-overdue apology. She had waited years, it seemed, to hear such genuine acknowledgement rather than excuses wrapped in false justification. Thank you for saying that, she said softly. It means more than you likely realize, Father. I do not know if I can forget entirely what happened that night, but I find myself increasingly able to forgive it, especially watching the genuine effort you have shown these past months toward becoming a better man. Your husband has shown me remarkable patience, Gerald said, gratitude evident in his tone, more than I deserved, certainly, given how his own family suffered under circumstances not entirely dissimilar to my own failures. I intend to honor the trust he has extended, Elena, not merely to repay my debts, but to become someone worthy of the daughter I so carelessly bargained away. Elena reached across the desk, taking her father's hand in a gesture of reconciliation she had not expected to offer so readily when she first arrived. I believe you, she said, and I am proud of the effort you are making now, however difficult the path ahead may still prove. They spoke for another hour, conversation flowing more easily between them than it had in years. Old wounds slowly beginning to heal beneath honest acknowledgement and genuine effort toward change. When Elena finally departed, promising to return again soon, she felt a weight lifting from her chest that she had carried since that terrible rain-soaked night when her future had first been bargained away like common property. The carriage ride back to Ashworth Hall carried her through streets now familiar and welcoming rather than threatening, past shops and homes she had come to recognize during months of building a genuine life within this new world she had once entered as a frightened stranger. Snow had begun falling gently as evening approached, dusting rooftops and gardens in soft white that reminded her of the peaceful transformation her own life had undergone since that first desperate night. That evening, as snow fell softly outside the windows of the study where their relationship had first begun deepening months earlier, Alexander presented Elena with a small wrapped gift, his expression carrying nervous anticipation unusual for a man typically so composed. Inside, Elena found a delicate silver locket, engraved with both their initials intertwined, and inside, a small portrait of Alexander's beloved rose garden, the very place where his mother's memory lived on through careful, dedicated tending. I wanted you to have something that represents not merely our marriage, Alexander explained, but everything we have built together since that first difficult night. Not a transaction, not a rescue, but a genuine partnership chosen freely by two people who found unexpected happiness, amid circumstances neither of us initially wanted. Elena's eyes filled with grateful tears as she fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its weight settle against her heart like a promise finally fulfilled. It is beautiful, she whispered. Thank you, Alexander, not merely for this gift but for everything, for seeing me as more than circumstances that first brought us together, for choosing partnership over convenience, honesty over easy silence, and love over mere obligation. You are the one who taught me love could exist beyond guilt and duty, Alexander replied softly, drawing her into his embrace as snow continued falling gently outside their window. I entered our marriage believing I was simply preventing another tragedy, Elena. I never expected to find such profound happiness alongside that protection. You have given me a reason to believe in genuine partnership again, something I feared had died alongside William all those years ago. Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, finally at peace after months of uncertainty, scandal, and fear. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, whatever difficulties her father's continued recovery might bring, whatever echoes of Charlotte's desperate obsession might occasionally surface, Elena knew now, with absolute certainty, that she and Alexander would face them together, bound not by debt or desperate circumstance, but by genuine love that had grown steadily stronger through every trial they had overcome. The ruthless Duke, who had once offered twice the price for a stranger's hand, had, in the end, given her something far more valuable than any fortune or title could provide: a partnership built on honesty, respect, and love, freely chosen rather than merely purchased. And Elena, once bargained away like property in her father's rain-soaked study, had found in Ashworth Hall not merely a grand estate to call home, but a genuine family, forged through hardship into something unshakable and true. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily over Ashworth Estate, blanketing the gardens in quiet, peaceful white, while inside, beside a crackling fire, two people who had once been strangers bound by circumstance now stood together as true partners, their future finally, genuinely their own to shape as they chose, free at last from the shadows of debt, scandal, and doubt that had once threatened to consume everything they had worked so carefully to build.